Okay, I think we can start now. Hi everyone, and thanks for joining my webinar on the topic of setting up your virtual store fast using ORM in Node.js. My name is Christian Boszkowski, and I'm technical consultant at the Microsoft department at Interworks. So on our agenda for today, we got several items, about which I'll talk. We got first. We'll start with the problems that a lot of companies are facing during the COVID-19 outbreak, and I'll try to provide a solution for some of those problems. Then I'll explain what is an ORM and what are the benefits of using ORM. Then I'll talk briefly about Sequelize and why did I choose this specific ORM for my demo application. Then I'll show you my demo application that I made for this webinar, and at last but not least, we'll have a questions and answers session where you can ask your questions. Okay, so let's start with the problems that a lot of companies are facing during the COVID-19 outbreak. So the COVID-19 outbreak took a lot of people as well as businesses by surprise. So everything happened suddenly, and a lot of people found themselves stuck at home, unable to actually go out and unable to visit physical stores. At the same time, the businesses were also caught by surprise, and a lot of them had to close their physical locations, their physical stores, and turn their attention on their virtual stores or so-called online stores. But some businesses did not have online stores so far and were not ready to actually make this transition. So they felt the need to move their business move their business fast from the physical environment to a virtual environment and create online stores. Let's switch for a second. Let's switch our attention from the companies to the developers. Developers for those companies during the COVID-19 outbreak got an increased a number of requirements that they had to accomplish in order to actually create those virtual stores for the businesses. And as we know, like with many other things in life, in development, if you rush something, usually it will have less quality and it will be much harder to maintain. So the companies and their developers had to decide whether to go with speed and actually accomplish their and actually get their virtual stores fast to the users, but at the same time sacrifice the quality, or to choose quality but have to accept the fact that it will take much more time to develop that virtual store and get it available to the customers. But what if it doesn't have to be that way? What if there's actually a way to have both the quality and the speed, and to actually create this virtual store as fast as possible, and at the same time maintaining the high quality of the software? Well, there is a way, and we'll discuss about it. So let's not focus on the whole solution, but let's focus on a specific part, which is a big part of the backend development. Let's focus on the code on the backend, which is used to actually connect and interact with the database. This code usually takes a big portion of the code which we write on the backend, and more often than not, it takes a lot of the development time to actually write this code. So if we somehow find a way to reduce the time needed to develop this code, and at the same time keep the quality of the code high, then we can provide that online store fast, that virtual store fast, and at the same time provide high quality software. So that's where ORMs are coming to the picture. So what is an ORM? ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping, and basically it's the idea that you are able to interact with the database by using an object-oriented language. With other words, ORMs allow you to use your language of choice, the language in which you're proficient. For example, NodeJs, C#, Java, etc., instead of having to learn and master a SQL language to actually be able to interact with the database. Here, I want to mention that even though the knowledge in SQL is not required, it is a good thing to actually have some basic knowledge on SQL before using ORMs, so that you know what's happening under the hood. Okay, so here also ORM can mean object relational mapper, which is the tool created for your favorite language or framework, and it can be used to provide this object relational mapping concept inside your application. Here on the first picture, we can try to explain how ORM works. So on the left, we got a database here, which has some tables inside. On the right side, we got our application. Inside our application, we are working with classes. For example, this mentioned user class. And in ORM terms, these classes are called models. So those models, each of those models is the same as one table in the database. We create those classes or models inside our application, and we work with them and their instances. And at that time, the ORM is automatically managing the database and making sure that our models are connected to the database and that we can work with the database automatically. Also, inside our models actually have their properties, which are actually the columns inside our table, inside the database. And inside our application, we're also working with instances or with objects created from those classes, which have specific values and which correspond to the rows inside our inside the table inside our database. So, for example, here you can see a simple two simple objects, author1 and author2, which are created from a class named author. That class has a couple of properties, which are ID, first name, last name, age, and country. And those objects, because they are instances of that class, they have specific values for each of those properties. So here you can see those two objects, and we're inside our database. We're working with those objects, but the ORM is automatically managing them. And inside the database, we can see on the picture below that each of those objects correspond to one row. For example, the first one got all the values for the properties same as this row, and the second one corresponds to the second row inside our database. So basically, this part here on the first picture, if you can see, is what is the ORM, and it automatically translates our classes and instances of those classes to database tables and rows inside those tables, and allows us to actually interact with that database. So talking about ORMs, it's important to know what benefits can they provide us. And there are actually a lot of benefits that we can get for using ORMs inside our applications. One of them is productivity. How do we get productivity by ORMs? Like ORMs, actually, a lot of the famous ORMs are actually a lot of the code inside the backend is a code which connects to our database, which is for interacting with our database, and it takes a big portion of the development time to actually write this code. The ORMs can automatically generate this code for us, and they can do that in a couple of seconds, which means that we are reducing the time of development and at the same time increasing the developers' productivity because they can focus on the other important parts of their application. Then one of the benefits is application design, which we're getting because a lot of those ORMs are created by experienced software architects, and they are created by following the best standards, which means that once we use those ORMs inside our application, we are ensuring that all of the database interaction code is actually written to the best practices, which means that our application retains the high quality. Separation of concerns, because we're using ORM, we're actually separating all of the code which is used for interacting with the database from the rest of the backend code, and that leads us to our next benefit, which is code reuse. By separating our database interaction code from the other code of our application, we're making sure that we can actually reuse that database interaction code on more than once inside our applications, inside our application if needed, as well as reuse it across applications. The next benefit is application maintainability. A lot of those ORMs are actually well tested before they are put to production. So once we use one of those, we can be sure that it is well tested, and we don't have to write extensive testing for that specific piece of code, which is for connecting of the database. Performance. So as I mentioned, a lot of those ORMs are written by experienced software architects. So the queries which they generate are optimized, and usually they give us better performance than the queries which we can manually write. Another important thing to mention here is that a lot of ORMs are database agnostic, which means that they can be used with different kinds of databases, for example, with MySQL, Microsoft SQL, PostgreSQL, Sequelize, etc. And it's pretty easy to actually switch from one of those databases to another one, but by just changing a couple of lines of code or configuration. And another important thing is that a lot of those ORMs are giving us advanced features for working with databases out of the box. So let's talk a little bit about Sequelize. When I was creating my demo application, I decided to create it using NodeJs and Express, and I chose MySQL as the database, the relational database which I'll be using. And when I was picking up ORM which I'll use inside my application, I found a couple of different ones for Node.js, but Sequelize is the one that stands out. The most important things about Sequelize is that it has extensive documentation, it has a large community, it provides us with a lot of cool features which we can use inside our application, and this ORM is easy to use inside the application. Also, important thing to mention here is that you can find a lot of resources online. You can find about Sequelize. You can find Sequelize in a lot of tutorials and inside a lot of production, inside a lot of applications which are already in production. So without further ado, let's move on to my demo application. So for this webinar, I created a simple demo applications for the backend for bookstore. In that application, we're working with books, so each book should have a type, genre, author, publisher. Here, I'll try to first explain the setup which I have for the Node.js applications quickly, and then I'll move on to the important part, which is how to set up the ORM inside the Node.js application and how to work with data inside it. So here you can see that I opened the entry file for my application, which is app.js, and inside that I'm creating my Node.js server using Express, which is a framework designed for Node.js. I allow that server to listen on a specific port, so it will wait for requests and serve them. Also, inside my application, for convenience use, I'm using a couple of middleware. For example, because my application is working with JSON data, I'm using a middleware that allows the server to actually understand that JSON data. Also, I'm using a middleware to set up the course origin headers. And here are the routes which I'm using, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I have a code to actually work with the errors which may happen inside the application. So basically, that's the setup of the Node.js Express server. Aside from that, like in every Node.js application, I got created routes. For example, as I mentioned here, I have the routes. If the request comes to the auto route, I'm using the auto routes. So sorry, I opened something else. Yeah, here it is. I'm using the auto routes, and inside that routes, I got the routes for the basic CRUD operations, which are actually the operations for working with database. CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. So here I got a route for get, which allows me to get all the authors from the database to my application. I got also get a specific author. I got a create author route, which inside has some validations set up. So to make sure that the values that I'm getting for before creating are the values that I need. Also, I got update route here, which also has the validation setup, and I have a delete route. For all of those different routes which I have, basically I have the same CRUD operation setup. The last part of the Node.js applications, which is not concerning the ORM, are the controllers. For example, the author controller here, in which I have specific controllers for each of those routes, and inside the controllers actually is my logic for handling my application logic. So basically, this is a really simple application, and it's convenient for explaining inside this webinar. That was all for the application. Let's now move on to the important part, which is setting up of the ORM inside this application. So first thing when working with Node applications is that we have to install specific packages. In this case, we need a package for the ORM, and we need a package for the database driver, which will allow us to work with that specific database. Here, to actually, because I chose to work with Sequelize and MySQL as the database, I need to install Sequelize and MySQL packages. That can be done by writing inside the console npm install --save to actually save them in my package.json file, and the names of the packages, which are Sequelize, which is the ORM which I'll be using, and the other one is MySQL2, which is actually a driver to allow me to work with MySQL database. I won't run this command right now because I have those already installed in my project, but if you're starting to work with ORMs, first thing you need to do is to actually install the ORM and the specific database driver. So once I install them, they will show up inside the package JSON. So you can see here that I have the Sequelize ORM and MySQL2 database drivers already installed. So how do we actually set up the ORM? First thing, we actually need to set up a connection to the database. By using an ORM and specifically using Sequelize, it's pretty easy to set up this connection to the database. You can see that this file, which I just opened, is creating that connection, and it has only a couple of lines of code. So to actually create the connection to our database, first we need to import the Sequelize object from the Sequelize package which we installed, and then on that create an instance from that object where we pass our database connection string, the database user, and the database password which we'll be using. Here I have them set up in a different file, and I inject them during runtime as environment variables for convenient use. Aside from those three things, an important thing is to actually pass in an object which will hold all of the settings which we want to set up for database, because this is a really simple application. The only thing right now which I need are setting up the host, and I have set it up to be a local host because I have my database running locally, and the dialect which tells the ORM which database are we using at the moment. Because I'm using MySQL, the dialect is set up to MySQL. So as you can see, setting up the connection to the database is just a few lines of code, and it's pretty simple and easy. Aside from those two things which I set up here, there are a couple of other things which can be configured, and you can find them on the Sequelize documentation, but for a simple application, this is a pretty good setup. So now we got the connection with the database, but we need to actually test if this connection is working. So we can do that in our app.js file, which is the entry file. How do we test the connection? We can test the connection by calling that connection, which I named Sequelize, and calling the sync method inside, which is automatically added by Sequelize. As you can see, I don't have that kind of method written here. It is automatically added, and once we call this sync method, it will synchronize our objects or models inside our application, about which I'll talk in a minute, and with the tables inside the database. Because I have passed in author as true as a property in this function, it will actually allow me to make changes to the database by making changes in my classes or so-called models. And because database is such an important part of my application, I'm having a check to make sure that I have the database connection ready before I actually start accepting requests on this API, on this server, because otherwise, without database, in this kind of application, we basically can't do anything. Okay, now we got the database connection, and we actually tested the database connection, and it is working. The next thing which is important when configuring the ORM, and especially Sequelize, is that because we are working with relational databases, we must set up the relations between those databases. So here you can see that setting up those relations between between tables inside the database is pretty easy. It only takes a couple of lines of code. So for example, as I mentioned, inside the database, I got a couple of tables. I got a book table, author table, genre table, publisher table, and type table. And author, genre, publisher, and type tables are actually connected to the book table. And the connection is that one book can have is that one author can have multiple books. One genre can one book many books can belong to the same genre. One publisher can have a lot of books as well published, and inside one type there can be multiple books. So basically, all of the connections inside relational databases can be divided into three types: one-to-one connection, one-to-many, and many-to-many connection. So because this is a really simple application, all of the connections which I need here between tables are one-to-many, as I mentioned. And to actually set up those connections, it's pretty easy. On the models, which I'll talk about in a second, we are calling specific functions, specific methods, which are automatically added by Sequelize. One of them is hasMany, which sets up one-to-many connection. And for convenience reasons, I also set up for example, it sets up the one-to-many connection from author to book, like one author can have many books. But for convenience reasons, I'm also setting up the reverse connection, which is that a book must belong to one author. That same thing is set up for all of the tables which I have. And aside from those, hasMany and belongs to methods which are for one-to-many connection relations. There are a couple of other methods provided to us by Sequelize for many-to-many connections and for one-to-one connection. Okay, so by a couple of lines of code, we actually got our connections or our relations between tables set up. So now let's move on to the next part, which are the classes or so-called models. We'll just open one of the models so we can see how that's created. So in order to actually set up tables inside our database and work with those tables and the data inside them, we need to create classes or so-called models. Those classes are actually what we'll be using inside our application to work with the data, and this class automatically will be translated to a table inside by Sequelize inside our MySQL database. So for example, I want to create an author table. So in order to do that, I need to create that author model or author class. I do that by also calling the Sequelize object from that Sequelize package, as well as having my connection, which is also named Sequelize, available here. So I'm creating that class. It's named author, and I actually call the define method on my Sequelize database connection, which I didn't create, but it was automatically created by the ORM. And I pass in a couple of things in this define method. First, I need to pass the name of that class or that model, which is author. And by passing this name, if I don't add additional configuration, it will make sure to use the plural form of this name and name our table inside the database with the plural form of this. So for example, if I name this author, the table inside our database will be named authors. Also, I can change that behavior by passing in just a couple of lines of configuration to this. Aside from the name, we actually need to know which properties will that table have, or which columns will be there inside the table. So for example, for the authors, we want to have an ID, first name, last name, age, and country. I think that those are enough for a simple application. And we can set them up inside the database by just adding properties inside this class. So we got the ID, first name, last name, age, and country. In order to actually add constraints to the database, because we want to make sure that the data which we are getting from the application is actually the right data which we need, we can easily set up constraints here by adding an object here, in which we can actually set up those different constraints. For example, for the ID, we want it to be from type integer number. We also want it to be auto increment, because we want to make sure that each successive row added to the database will have different ID, and it will be easy to actually manage by having it auto increment. Another thing which we want to make sure for all of these properties is that we don't want them to be null. We don't want them to be empty, but we want all of them to actually have some value. And we're setting up the constraint that this ID is actually a primary key, which means that it needs to be unique, and it will be our main way of identifying that table row, that specific table row. For the other ones, we set up similar configurations. For example, we want the first name to be of type string, the last name of type string as well, the age of type integer number, the country of type string, and etc. So basically, by just creating a class and passing up a couple of properties inside with some small configuration, we actually created a table inside our database. Or if we already created that table manually, if we are going with database first approach, we just created a way for us to actually interact with that database, with that table inside the database. So if you can see, it's pretty easy to actually create the models or the classes for our application. And the last part of actually setting up the ORM, it's actually creating the logic to work with data. And this is one of the most important things inside our application. And it's one of the things that the ORM is making much easier. For example, inside our controllers, where we have all of the application logic, we are adding the database connection logic or the database interaction logic. For example, inside getAuthors method, getAuthors controller, which should return all of the authors which exist in all of the records, all of the authors which exist inside the authors table inside our database. We are actually calling a method on our author model, on our author class. As you can see here, we didn't create any kind of methods, but they were automatically provided to us by the Sequelize ORM, and that method is actually findAll. By calling this findAll method on author table, we can make sure that the ORM will query the database behind the scene, and it will return all of the records inside that table, inside that author table, and we can actually use them, send them as part of the response to the user and stuff like that. So basically, by just writing this one line of code, we have access to the database, and we can get all of the records from that specific table. FindAll method is provided to us by Sequelize, and it's pretty easy to use. If we didn't have this, if we were working manually, we would have to write SQL queries to actually accomplish the same thing. Another method, for example, which we can automatically get is the method find by primary key. For example, if we need to get a specific record, a specific author from that author table, we can call the find by PK method, or that's short for find by primary key, and we can pass in the author ID, which we set up to be actually the primary key for this table. By calling this method, we're making sure that the behind the scenes Sequelize will actually will write a SQL query, which will give us the specific value, the specific entry from the table that we need inside our application. So we'll get only one, and we'll get the specific author which we need. Also, how about creating authors inside the database? Well, that's pretty easy as well, because on create author I had set up some validation logic to make sure that the data which I'm getting for that author is not wrong. It's in the right format and it's the right data which I need. First, I'm checking if I have any validation errors, and if not, then I'm making the call to the database and creating that author in this example. So to create an author, it's pretty easy as well. Instead of writing a lengthy SQL query, we can just call the create method on our author model or author class. And that in that create method, we are actually passing the values for all of the properties which we have inside our table in the database. So by calling this method, we're making sure that we can create that author, that entry inside our table by just calling one line of code, basically. Another thing is updating authors. So is that much harder than the previous ones? Well, no, it's not. It's pretty easy because just like with before, we need to know which specific author we're updating. So by calling the find by primary key method, we can get the data for that specific author inside our application from the database, and then update the values which needs to be updated, and we can just update that specific value inside the database by just calling the save method, which will save our new object which we have here with the updated values as at the place of the old one which we had inside the database. And the last operation is delete. Deleting is pretty easy as well. To know which specific author we would like to delete, we first need to find it. We also call the find by primary key method. We find that specific author, and then on that specific author, we are calling the destroy method, also provided by Sequelize, which allow us to delete any entry from the database. So basically, as you can see, that this is the logic for interacting with the database. Was usually 1 or 2 lines of code, and it saved us a lot of time writing that instead of writing the SQL queries by just calling these ready-made methods which we have provided by Sequelize. So these were really simple operations here. But how about some more complex operations which we want to run? And for some of those more complex operations, there are already ready-made methods, especially for the ones which are widely used. But if there is any complex SQL query which we want to run, and there is not a specific method provided to us by Sequelize, or if we actually prefer working with real SQL, with SQL queries, then we can actually do that by using the ORM as well. We can call the query method provided by Sequelize, and inside we can pass in our queries which we want to run. So for example, instead of to get all of the types from my types table, instead of calling the final method, if I prefer using queries, I can just call the query method, and inside pass my query, which I write manually. So it's pretty simple to actually use manual queries inside this, as well as use the already provided methods. And this is especially important for some of the things you want to do with the database that a ready-made function does not exist. Another thing here, which is important to mention, is that if we open another controller in which I have more advanced queries, for example, table joins, it's pretty easy actually to work with table joins in Sequelize. For example, if we were not using Sequelize to actually retrieve data from connected tables, for example, because book is connected with all of the other tables, type, genre, author, and publisher, we would have to write table joins and to actually join those tables and get specific data from all of them that we need to return to the user. But by using Sequelize, it's pretty easy to actually write join queries. It's also pretty convenient to use them. So it is something like this. To actually get all of the books, but for books we also want to get some data for the type of the book, the genre of the book, the author which has written the book, and the publisher for that book. So once again we're calling that same final method provided to us by Sequelize, and as a additional object inside that method we're passing the include statement, which allow us to actually automatically include the other data from other tables or other models, which are connected to our main model or main table by relations. Because book was connected with all of those other tables, we can actually get data for each of the books from the specific from the other tables. So if you call this method, we'll actually, aside from all of the books, all of the data for the book, we'll also get data for the type of the book, genre, author, and publisher. So as you can see, even working with joins inside our application by using ORM is made much easier and much faster. So basically, that's all of the features which I have in my demo application. In more complex application, you would probably implement a couple of other features which you can easily find inside the documentation for Sequelize. So let's get back to the presentation. And because we're done with everything for today, we can move on to the questions and answers session. So if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. Okay, let's move on to some of the questions. I see that we got some questions. One of those read, can you call store procedures inside your application? Well, actually, if you're using Sequelize, inside that SQL queries, probably you can use stored procedures as well. I haven't tried that, but I'm pretty sure that there's a way to actually do that if you really want to do that. But I think that it's better to actually stick up to the if you're using ORM, it's better to actually stick up to the ready-made methods provided to you by that ORM and only use Sequelize statements if there is some operation for which there is not already created method. Another question, should ORM be used with small applications or it can be used in an enterprise apps as well? ORMs like Sequelize, which I used here, can be used with all types of applications. It can be used with really small applications, with medium-sized applications, and with large enterprise applications as well. It can be implemented in any kind of apps, in virtual stores, anything basically. In any application, it will provide the couple of positive things which I mentioned a couple of slides before here. It will give you those benefits for every kind of application, no matter the size or the type of application which you're using. Another question is Sequelize mature enough to be used in production? Yes, I already worked with an application which is in production and is using Sequelize. And if you search on the internet, you can find a lot more applications working on production that are utilizing the power of Sequelize and the power of other ORMs. Okay, let's wait for another minute if there are other questions. Okay, I can see that there are no other questions for now. So at the end, I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to attend my webinar. And I would like to thank Interworks for giving me this opportunity. I hope that you learned something new by watching this webinar and that you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thanks.